This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and this is the Unsolicited Response Show. My guest this episode is Chris Hughes, who, along with Nikki Robinson, recently published and wrote the book Effective Vulnerability Management. I found this book to be a real solid overview of the current and consensus state of vulnerability management, which includes much more than just patching. It includes all sorts of vulnerabilities, and we get that into the show. The book covers a lot of areas. It covers patching, patch management, cloud issues with patch management, as well as containers and virtual infrastructure issues. It includes DevOps, a wide variety of sorts of things, threat intelligence. I got to about half of the questions I had for Chris in the book, but I tried to focus them on the questions that are most important to my viewers here, the people that are in OT security. So I hope you'll enjoy that interview. I would also note that the book includes a lot of links to articles, papers, and other books. Chris kind of did his research and in many cases will provide you with, here is a document from NIST, for example, and here is a 2-page summary of what that document is. It doesn't have a lot of, let's say, leading edge or bleeding edge comments or information, or really a lot of opinions that vary from what the mainstream thinks. But I really would recommend this book to someone who wants to get an overview of understanding vulnerability management. So perhaps something good for someone looking to put together a program, looking to evaluate a program, perhaps someone that is at the early stages of their program would be best served by this book. Now, before we get to my interview, just one other thing I wanted to note, and that is the S4 call for presentations will come out on June 15th. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to create a video the Wednesday before that, which will give you advice on how to get on the S4 stage. I do this every year, and what you'll find is if you listen to the advice, you'll save yourself a lot of time. You won't write something really long that isn't applicable. You'll have a better chance of getting accepted. So please, if you are considering submitting something to S4, which I hope you do, especially if you haven't spoken at S4 before, you're really going to want to watch that video. But for now, just try to find an idea that you think is new and important for the OT security community. Now, let's go to my interview with Chris Hughes. Joining me on the Unsolicited Response Show is Chris Hughes. He is the co-founder and president of Acquia. He's a cyber innovation fellow with CISA. He has his own podcast, the Resilient Cyber Podcast, and I believe a Substack with the same name. And the reason we have you on the show this time, Chris, is you are the author, along with your co-author, Nikki Robinson, of the book Effective Vulnerability Management that came out recently. So first, welcome to the show.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to be here. I followed your content for quite a while, so I'm excited to be on the show and chat with you.
Likewise. It's funny that we haven't talked before because I think we've commented on each other's posts for years. I'd like to start out every time I interview an author with the same question is, who did you write this book for? Who is your ideal reader for this book?
So it's interesting. I wrote, professionally for, I'd say, not necessarily a CISO. CISO is definitely part of it in terms of vulnerability management programs, but I'd say the folks leading vulnerability management programs within organizations who are kind of juggling with this burdensome task of more vulnerabilities, more findings, more noise, more tools, just that burden that we all know from doing vulnerability management in different organizations, different industries, and so on. And then personally, I wrote it for my kids, honestly, just to show them, hey, here's what can happen if you work hard and, stick with something. You can do something cool, put something out there with your name on it.
Well, I was going to save this to the end, but when we're talking about writing books, but you put on another book last year. So, I mean, I could not believe that you put out 2 books, written them, published them within 12 months. Are we going to expect another one in 9 months?
So if it was up to me, you would, but the publisher said, say, hey, let's, wait a little bit, let this book, do its thing in the market for a while before we put another one out there. But for me, I really enjoy writing. It helps me think, organize my thoughts on different topics, software supply chain security, open source, vulnerability management, those kind of things. I do a lot of blogging and stuff like you talked about. So it's just a way to kind of articulate my thoughts on paper, basically.
And when I ask you this next question, it's not to validate or invalidate you, but I'm kind of curious. Most of the audience here, or probably 99% of the audience here, focuses on OT security, industrial control systems and such. What background, if any, do you have in OT or cyber physical systems? It doesn't. If the
Yeah.
answer is none, it doesn't disqualify you. I'm just trying to set kind of expectations for our audience.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I haven't done a ton of work in that space, in terms of ICS or OT, things like that, cyber physical systems. But I have done a lot of work in the world of defense, Department of Defense and national security systems, which have, obviously a physical element to them, weapon systems, things like that. And I have a solid understanding of, how these physical systems, like you point out, are increasingly being driven by cyber and software. So, I think it's a definitely unique niche. It's a challenging environment that it has some constraints that enterprise, business systems don't have that make it even more challenging and even more of a critical topic, in my opinion, because, we see breaches all the time, right, to, software companies, business systems, and so on. And it doesn't really, I think we've seen a lot of fatigue from folks in that regard. But when you talk about physical systems that start to impact critical infrastructure in society, that's a whole nother level of risk. And I think it really gets people's attention.
hmm One of the things I found interesting reading the book is I thought that was the answer because I didn't think this was really a major area of your study. But as I was reading parts of it, it sounded exact industry who say, "Oh, IT doesn't understand our world at all." For example, in patching, um, you were talking about systems with very high uptime that require testing in dev, phase deployment, patching windows, and such. And I think that one of the things I've been trying to get people to understand is that there is such a thing as mission critical IT that has almost exactly the same requirements as OT. It might not have the same impact. People don't die if things go wrong, but a lot of times I think people in our industry think of IT as desktop management, that you're managing employees, email servers, and that's it. Uh, in your career, have you run across things that you'd put in a category that would be like mission critical IT? What types of systems would those be?
Yeah, I think I'm glad to hear you say that, right? Because I haven't done a lot in the ICS or OT space, but there are mission critical systems, and I've had an opportunity to work with several of them. I've worked with Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. So you're talking about, systems that process, payments for Medicare and Medicaid recipients, especially a certain time of year that can be really problematic for healthcare enrollment and things like that. I've worked with Department of DHA, Defense Health Agency, I'm sorry, that does a lot of work with the military treatment facilities and things like that. So you're talking about doctors' communications, patients, medical prescriptions on time and services for veterans and things of that nature. I've worked in the Department of Defense where we have forward deployed troops using systems that are deployed in on-prem and hybrid cloud environments. People using these in real-time exercises for military purposes. So there's definitely that critical element to it, in my opinion, when it comes to you're talking about people's lives. So there's military exercises, safety, medical treatment, medications, things like that. These all matter to people a lot as well.
Well, we can be even crass from a business perspective. I mean, it's been many decades. It's all moved to the cloud, but I worked with a company in the early 2000s that was doing airline reservations. They were one of the big ones that handled airline reservations, and they told me how much it cost them per minute of downtime, and it was a number that very quickly became a high consequence event. So they treated their uptime requirement the same as someone who would be worrying about loss of life, whether whether you want to compare those or not. The executives treated them just as seriously. So it is an issue, and I think when people read this book, they'll be surprised at how many times they'll run across things that they'll say, oh, that sounds like OT, even though you weren't writing it from an OT perspective. uh, let's dive in now. The title of the book, Effective Vulnerability Management. There's a lot on patching. There's a lot on coding bugs and patching, but I think I was really pleased at the beginning you used the NIST definition of a vulnerability, which is I'm going to read something here, a quote, a weakness in an information system, system security procedures, internal controls, or implementation that could be exploited or triggered by a threat source. Maybe for the listeners, what would be some examples of vulnerabilities that are not coding bugs that need to be patched?
Yeah, I think it's a good distinguishing thing to point out is there's something to be said about patching and software flaws and intrinsic weaknesses in a system, right? That can be exploited from the onset of its existence. It's an application that you've bought or a piece of software you're using, or whatever. But there's other things, as you point out, that could be misconfigurations. It could be weaknesses in your organizational policies and processes. It could be a flaw or the way someone's consuming and using software that now make it vulnerable for being exploited, for example. So it's not only simply patch. And I know we'll get into this later too, but the patching approach is very problematic too, and we struggle to keep up with that on that front. But it could be a lot of different things, like I said, misconfigurations, weaknesses in how we use a piece of equipment, for example, or a piece of software and application, and so on, or even the way that we've structured our organizational policies and processes, our people as well. We have a whole section in the book titled "Focused on the Human Element." Right, my co-author has her PhD in human factors in cybersecurity. We often focus on the tools and the tech. But behind it, there's people who have emotions and egos and cognitive overload and things that we don't really think about typically that can also be exploited. And we see human factors, for example, be a leading cause of cybersecurity incidents year over year, and things like DBIR and others.
It's funny, just to deviate on that human factor thing you mentioned. There's a brief section in the book that talks about alert fatigue. And in the ICS world, we would call that alarm fatigue. And it's very common that if you give the operators too many alarms, they just click acknowledge, and they don't actually ever dig into it. So would you consider too many alerts or alarms a vulnerability?
I definitely, I personally think so, and I think even too many tools like these tools, like the alerts are being generated often by security tools and things that we've put in place and configurations and things we've set up, right? And often we have so many tools, so many alerts, so many findings, et cetera, that are being brought to the attention of the operator, whether you're talking about a vulnerability analyst or someone working in an OT environment, et cetera. That it starts to have a cognitive overload impact on that individual. Like you said, you start to ignore everything. And the problem is, like, it's a needle in a haystack scenario where every once in a while, that thing you ignored is going to be a legitimate thing that required your attention. And you're so fatigued by the noise that you're not paying attention anymore. And then now that's when something serious can happen. So we need to think about how many tools we have, how many alerts they're generating, how many findings we're dumping on our engineering and development peers that they now start to ignore us because they went back and forth with us and explained that, hey, this isn't a finding, or this is a false positive, right? Those things as well can lead to situations where we're no longer paying attention, and then something happens that we actually really need to be worried about.
Okay, you wrote the book, Effective Vulnerability Management. You're the guru. So I'm going to ask you one of the questions that's been vexing the OT community, the ICS security community for years. We have many protocols, actually most of our protocols, and certainly 98+% of our protocols that are deployed that lack authentication for control commands, for management commands. Think about them for changing a recipe in food and bev, or opening and closing valves and pipelines, or things of that nature. That no authentication at all. If you can access them, you can send the command to make whatever change you want. Now back in 2011, Marty Edwards, he was the director of ICS CERT, which was the precursor for CISA. He was kind of faced with this problem. Do we put a vulnerability? Do we create an alert for Modbus because it's insecure by design, DNP3, Profinet, all these sorts of things? And he said, he said that they would not do that. I was looking for his quote here. I can't find his exact quote, but he basically said they're not going to cover anything that is a feature or something working as designed in the system. And if you look still at what CISA puts out, they don't issue alerts on any of these protocols. In your mind, are they vulnerabilities? And if so, how would you treat something that is kind of like this insecure by design problem? Not a lack of secure by design, but actually working as intended and completely insecure.
Yeah, I'm trying not to laugh when you were saying that, because the individual in the organization you point out was kind of a precursor to CISA, who ironically now is the biggest cheerleader and champion of secure by design. So it's really ironic to have an individual in that role at that point say that they're not going to issue advisories or alerts for this because it's working as intended. Yet here we are now saying, hey, everything needs to be secure by design. I would personally think that that's definitely a vulnerability or a flaw, at least an inherent flaw that needs to be addressed that poses risk to the organization and operations. But the challenge there is now you need to enumerate every potentially inherently flawed aspect of an application, a piece of software, a system, etc., that isn't necessarily a vulnerability in the code, but just a way that it's not designed properly or sufficiently, right, or securely. And that can be challenging too, because we already have so many kind of quote unquote known vulnerabilities that we're wrestling with. But I mean, the fact that you point that out is alarming, right? For folks like me who don't work in that community and think about everything in our society that runs on these systems. The fact that, they say like hackers don't hack in, they log in. Well, in this case, you can log in with no authentication, it sounds. So that's
you don't even log in, you just access.
You just access it. Yes, that sounds incredibly. And then it's ironic to hear that that's the way we operate in the world of zero trust, right? No implicit trust, but here's not even authentication or verification. It's just you're authorized. You send a command, you're good to go.
Yeah, I mean, we say access equals compromise, and it's one of the. Well, I'll get off my soapbox, but it's one of the challenges I have with CISA, with their cybersecurity performance goals and all these things that they're putting out, and yet sometimes they'll say it buried deep in some document as just a kind of a throwaway line, but we have yet to see them pick up the banner and say, these protocols that control our critical systems and manage them, administer them, need to at least have authentication. I mean, to me, once everything else you do, if that's not true, is really limited value, except you're back in that old world where you can't let them inside, because once they're inside, they can do the damage. But
it's reverting back to the perimeter-based, castle and moat approach that we've now heard so much about how we need to get away from. And I think what you're pointing out is it just shows you how much of the modern internet and networking was built on insecure protocols and designs that we didn't think about the way people would abuse or misuse these systems.
Well, in our case, it was a little different. It was never viewed that it would be part of the internet. So these were built when they thought they would always be separate systems, not connected to anything else. And the good news is there are now secure protocols available. The bad news is the pickup or usage rate of these, even on new systems, is in single digits.
Can I ask a question back to you? I know it's your show here, but I'm curious, like, you have these sector, CPGs, as you point out, but we know a lot of critical infrastructure is privately owned and operated, right? In terms of the critical infrastructure, how do you incentivize further adoption if the adoption rates are stalling or stagnant? Like, how do we incentivize that without some kind of regulatory measure or something like that?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to prioritization, which is where I want to go next, because your book hits that really hard. What personally, and I'm in the minority on this, but personally what I'm seeing is long lists of good security practices being pushed down to asset owners that will have minimal impact on risk. Now, you can't say they're wrong. They are good security practices. They will have some minor impact. In a perfect world, you would do them, but they're not the things that are going to really move the risk needle because of these problems. And we even see cases like, if you have a PLC that you can upload firmware, change logic, issue control commands, do you really care if there's a denial of service attack on that? Do you really want to patch that when you could just send it a command to turn it off? So why do you really care about a denial of service command? Yet we're prioritizing patching those sorts of things. So it's a challenge. But going back to your book, I thought that one of the things that came up over and over again was this concept of prioritization. That if we go now to patching, actually, I mean, some of the numbers that you have in this book, you have a lot of different studies and numbers in this book. Like you said, on page 29, on average, companies are only able to remediate 1 out of 10 new vulnerabilities per month. On page 94, the median remediation rate was 15.5%. The average organization has a backlog of over 100,000 vulnerabilities and climbing. So when you hear those numbers, I guess the first thing is, do you believe that we're going to end or enter a period where those numbers are going to go down? Or are we going to just be living with this growing number of vulnerabilities as a population and growing number of vulnerabilities unpatched on my systems if I'm a company?
Yeah, I hate to give the answer I'm about to give because it's not a very optimistic answer personally. But we talk about, like you talked about, you talked about in your previous answer how you came from a world where everyone didn't think that these systems would be connected, right? But now everything is connected all the time, everywhere, and everything is now driven by software. Nearly every aspect of our society, and I kind of look at it like the national debt. It's kind of run away at a pace that we simply cannot catch up with at this point. And that's why you see these organizations having these growing vulnerability backlogs, like I talked about, hundreds of thousands, even millions for large organizations. And organizations are using these outdated legacy kind of prioritization schemes like CVSS-based scores and things like that to kind of prioritize criticals and highs, whether it's actually known to be exploited, likely to be exploited, reachable, et cetera, et cetera. We just don't have a updated approach to deal with this. And then it's not just a technology thing. It's also, resource constraints of people and time and bandwidth and their focus, and then their incentive to do this too. We're talking about, trying to put things in front of developers to remediate, but they're not gauged on how many vulnerabilities they burn down in the backlog. They're gauged on how much, features they release from the product backlog, or how much revenue they help drive to the organization, or, things like that. So I personally, I really hate to give this answer, but I don't see us getting ahead of that number, except for if somehow there's a widespread adoption of, pivoting to more secure by design, secure by default systems, to where we see the number of vulnerabilities quit climbing and we're able to actually burn down that backlog. You're kind of like getting ahead of your spending habits, right? To where now you're able to tackle your personal or debt, right? In the sense of financials. I don't see how we could do it otherwise. Otherwise, the number is just going to keep growing. And we're going to keep trying to prioritize from a bigger and bigger bucket of vulnerabilities with the same or, similar amounts of resources, basically.
And you do consulting, you and your organization do consulting. You're also on that CISA task force. Would you even advise as a goal to reduce that number down to something where you're essentially, let's say you're have a backlog of 3 months worth of vulnerability. So if there was an actual vulnerability, I'm just going to pick fake numbers here, but if there were 1,000 new vulnerabilities a month, and you said we're not going to have more than 2,000 active vulnerabilities on our system, and we're going to have various statistics saying we're dealing with those. Are you advising clients now to try to push down to that almost zero base where you're dealing with everything, or are you advising clients that no, you need to deal with some percentage of the high ones, and after that, it's a bad expenditure of your resources?
Yeah, I'm a little bit in the later camp. At least, I'm advising in a more granular approach or a more nuanced approach. Like, for example, we have, CVSS base scores are a great kind of initial indicator, but we have things like the CISA known exploited vulnerability catalog. These are vulnerabilities that we know to be exploited. You talked about some of the metrics I gave. And I was alarmed to find out some of these myself. Like, for example, we have over 200,000 CVEs. Last year, I think it was 20,000 plus new CVEs that were published. Of those, less than 5% were actually known to be exploited. So we're prioritizing all the highs and criticals and things like that, but they may never actually be exploited by a malicious actor. And I was citing studies from organizations like Scientia. They're the one that found that 1 in 10, figure that you cited before about, remediating new vulnerabilities, for example. So I've been advising organizations and agencies and places that I work with to focus on things that are known to be exploited, or using things like exploit prediction scoring system, EPSS, things that are likely to be exploited in the next 30 days, or looking at the, new modern tools like software composition analysis that has reachability capabilities, for example. Is it actually reachable or invoked in the code? And then looking at, even further than that, like business context. Is it internet reachable? Is it, what kind of data data is on the system from a sensitivity perspective. How critical is the system to our operations? Because otherwise, like, you're just kind of tackling that big number. And some of the studies I show in there, they show that if you're just tackling, say, highs and criticals with no context of the things I just talked about, it's about the same as doing a random sampling of just patching anything, really. Like, it's not effective at all.
Well, I know that Kev is getting some good mind share. People are really embracing that, and I've seen people actually prioritizing those. What kind of mind share is the EPSS getting? That's the exploit prediction scoring system. Are people switching from CVSS to EPSS now, or is that still very new?
So I've given the answer that it's still relatively new. The ironic and interesting part here is it's actually EPSS and CVSS are both run by an organization called FIRST. They're just different SIGs, different groups of individuals, right? And I wouldn't say they're replacing CVSS with EPSS. They're looking to augment it. So, like, here's a CVSS score. Now we rally from that to look at EPSS and focus on things that are, and you can have an organizationally defined threshold of, say it's 0 to 1.0. So you can say 0.7 or 0.6, whatever you define as an acceptable threshold for your organization. And EPSS has some great research out there showing, like, different thresholds, it'll give you a different level of coverage of, vulnerabilities actually get exploited, for example, based on their findings. So I think organizations are starting to adopt it. I know from working with different security tools and vulnerability management platforms and so on, that they are starting to integrate EPSS into, their platforms and provide that score as an additional kind of metric that, vulnerability teams and organization security teams and developers and so on can use to prioritize vulnerabilities. But I think we still have a long way to go. I mean, CVSS has been around for a long time. We're all very comfortable with it. We know of it. We've used it for a long time.
We all hate it too, right?
We all hate it. Yes, we all hate it. But it's just been around a long time. So I think that the institutional inertia of getting us to kind of change that as an industry is going to take some time. And it's not that it's useless, but I mean, some in the EPSS community would say it is, for example. But I don't think it should be your leading, driver of prioritization.
Well, we had Art Mannion down at S4 with CERT back when he was with CERT. He's left there now. And he was we had 3 people on stage to give proposals for something besides CVSS. And his was the one that got the most traction. This was very early. This was 2018, I believe. He was just starting with some of the people at CERT to develop this, what's now called the SSVS, which I think people should just think they're decision trees that you make your decision on what you do in terms of dealing with that vulnerability. And he introduced it as a never, next, now approach, which was really great. I think it was much better than this SSVC. It was so clean. You do this decision tree and it just gets you to an answer. Do I patch it now? Do I patch it next maintenance period? Do I never patch it? And he did hedge a little bit. He said the things in never should be reconsidered periodically. But in general, it was that. And it's funny, in the OT world, Dragos has kind of adopted this. And in 2023, they said only 3% of the patch or 3% of the vulnerabilities fell in the now patching. So that's some pretty serious reduction. I'm a huge fan of this. We actually created an ICS patch decision tree that included safety, the impact on operations. It also included the security status of the device. Was it insecure by design? Then why bother patching it? And exposure. And it did include CVSS as kind of one of the factors, but it was a pretty low factor. Let me ask this in a 2-part. What are your thoughts on SSVC, these decision trees as a path forward, and what kind of pickup is it getting in the industry, if any?
Yeah. So this was another one that, I came across. And first off, Art is a savant on these topics. He's incredibly intelligent. He's a genius on this stuff. So not to put myself in the same conversation as Art, but I am familiar with SSVC, CISA, where I have a role as a cyber innovation fellow. It's a big proponent of the stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization system. And it does get to the context-driven approach that I was talking about. Mission essential functions it talks about, for example. Business criticality. It talks about safety, which is something you brought up in the OT context. The challenge I've seen so far of organizations that look to use it, and I've seen, some organizations I work with trying to start to adopt it, is those decision trees ultimately take time, attention, and resources, human capital, right, to kind of run that. You have to plug that information in and make those decisions and that criteria. And that's, it's one thing to do for one vulnerability or 10 or 100, but when you're talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, doing that at scale, it can become incredibly difficult to do. And I think that we'll see, as we move forward, tools and capabilities start to try to automate some of that, decision making and criteria selection, for example. But that takes me to my second answer, which is I haven't seen widespread adoption of it quite yet. I know of some organizations that are using it and advocating for its use. But I think when we're talking about, thousands and thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, it's just difficult to kind of use a manual intensive, decision tree type approach. But I'd be curious to see if there's people out there who have been able to scale it and automate aspects of it and so on. I just haven't seen it in practice yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen it a lot either. I would say, though, one thing is it depends a lot on your tree. And for example, the SZA tree is just awful for OT. Just terrible. You would never use it. I mean, I don't. I think mine is the best, of course, but I could see other people coming up with ones that are a lot better than the SZA tree. And I don't think you can create a tree for all sectors. And you might even want to modify the tree yourself. But one thing that I didn't see in your book that really made it appealing to me was, at least in the OT world, we can automate all this. Every factor except for that technical vulnerability, which is nominally now CVSS, maybe it should change to EPSS, is fixed and can be automated. So you can write code in a half day to automate the whole process. And all you do is you just feed in the vulnerability and it will tell you, assuming you have an asset inventory, which we haven't talked much about. We've talked so much about that in our space. I don't want to beat that horse again, but that was really the beauty of the technique, was you didn't have to spend even 5 minutes evaluating each vulnerability. It just spat out the other end once you automate it. Now, that might not be as possible in the IT realm where things aren't as static. In OT, you don't see things changing that much. They don't change where they exist. They're not, they're not immutable, or they're not ephemeral, I guess is the right thing. They're kind of stuck there for a while.
Yeah,
But
that's right where my mind went when you were talking about this. Is the environment you're talking about, it seems like it's much more practical. First off, like it's valuable. It's promising that you can do that because, as you talked about, those trees allow for things like safety, mission essential functions, and more considerations for the OT realm. And two, a lot of the environments I've worked in, not only were they more dynamic traditionally, but now you're talking infrastructure as code. You're talking about Kubernetes clusters, containers, microservices, DevSecOps. Things are always changing, being deployed in cloud, turned up, scaled down. It can be very difficult to even get an asset inventory, let alone try to automate some of that. But I think in those environments where you have more static physical systems, you can definitely start to kind of automate some of this because you know what your inventory looks like. You're not swapping out equipment, in minutes like you are with infrastructure as code and things like that. So I think that's promising that you can do that. And I like where you're going, where now you can start to automate some of that because the inventory hasn't changed quite so much, the architecture, et cetera. It's just a new vulnerability that you need to kind of apply the formula to.
right. And then that might change in our world. Our world is, I mean, we're slow to change, but we are seeing some things being deployed to the cloud, but they typically are less operational, and could fall into the same approach or program that you have for your mission critical IT assets. Let's talk a little bit about tooling. This is something I've never quite understood. You have vulnerability management systems that are typically, let's say those were mostly patching, missing patches. You have configuration management systems, and then you have remediation systems. So one thing I've always asked, and I've asked the Tenable folks, other scanners, Qualys and other things, they don't tend to do remediation. They will tell you, here are all the things that are missing, and then you have to go somewhere else to fix them. And even what I'm not sure is there a good interface between those two? Are those two commonly interfaced so no one has to kind of manually take those or export a spreadsheet or export a file and import it? Are they feeding each other and communicating these days?
Yeah, I'm being real careful not to name certain tools or products just because I like to stay agnostic. In the
Sure.
book the best I can, and then in a conversation like this, not to endorse any products, but we are seeing, at least in the application context, especially in the cloud native environments, seeing kind of an evolution. And I recently published an article about this too, an evolution of what we're calling application security posture management platforms. And those platforms are doing what you're talking about, which is aggregating all the findings from disparate security and vulnerability management tools and so on, and starting to drive towards actual like outcomes, remediations. Like, what do we do about it? How do we task the certain individuals responsible for these actions to go out and remediate something, and enriching that with the context we talked about of known exploitation, exploitation probability, reachability, business criticality, enriching it with that information along the way so that they can feed it to the individuals that are in a position to actually do something about it. So we are seeing that happen. I wouldn't say it's necessarily coming from some of the longstanding, the Tenables, the Qualises, the longstanding industry leaders per se. It's more in the venture-backed startup space with new modern innovative tooling. But we are seeing that happen, and I'm glad we're seeing it happening because I think the industry has realized, like, I have all these different tools with all these different findings. Nothing's aggregating them, enriching them, actually tasking or delivering the information to those that can go and do something about it. So it's a gap, and it goes back to the human element we talked about. You need, how long have you heard a single pane of glass? Well, the problem
Yeah.
is we live in a glass house surrounded by single panes of glass. We have 1,000 of them, right? So it's bringing all that together to make sense of it. That's really missing. I think some companies, some venture-backed startups and innovators are looking to get after that problem.
Well, you talk about tool overload and some of those issues in the book. The solution that I'm seeing, we have our own set of OT vulnerability management systems. The big four: Armis, Dragos, Nozomi, and Clarity. You've got Ralph with his OT base and a few other specialty ones out there. What they're doing is almost adding a tool. So they are now exporting these to ServiceNow. And ServiceNow is then creating tickets, which then go to another tool or possibly multiple tools. Maybe they go to one tool that does patching and another tool that does configuration management. Based on what you're talking about in your book, I would think that would not be appealing to you. Where do you stand on that type of ticketing? Everything goes through ticketing and it's kind of a hub and spoke sort of thing.
Yeah, that's to be honest with you, in the IT space, that's definitely still a thing too. You're talking Jira, ServiceNow, other systems that kind of capture information and metadata about a finding and who's responsible for it, when actions should be taken. So that still happens. You hear like kind of ticket ops is kind of a phrase thrown around. Now we're starting to see some asynchronous platforms start to be used, like Slack, right, and other kind of platforms like that, to maybe bring an alert or something to someone's attention. But anyone who's been in those kind of environments can say it can become just as bad. Now you have a massive backlog of tickets, or you have, a Slack channel with 750 notifications, and you're trying to figure out, what do I do here? So yeah, yet another tool is the same. Now you got to go into another platform to look into something, and then maybe you have to jump back to the big four you talked about to get more information about the finding or the vulnerability or the asset, et cetera. And all this is just taking a toll on the operators, the people who are going out here and trying to actually drive down the risk of the organization or the mission, et cetera.
I wonder though if the tooling matches the organizational structure. Because in my mind, I could see great value in having one tool do it all, but then I'm running into the case where the people that are doing vulnerability management are probably not the people that are going to approve and deploy the patches in OT. So maybe that's difficult. But then you also talk. I mean, I should really point out the book talks about a lot of things. Effective vulnerability management is the title. It talks about cloud, containers, secure by design, vulnerability threat intelligence. It covers a lot of ground. You get into DevOps and all sorts of things. And I'm wondering, in a DevOps world, maybe combining the tools makes more sense because you're talking about the same teams responsible for things. Do you think these tools mirror the actual structure, and will they change as the structure changes, or is that
I
because
think
I'm not close to DevOps world. I don't know if in the DevOps
no.
world they still separate those tools.
No, I'm just laughing because you're making me think of, and I don't want to get it wrong and sound silly, but is it Conway's law, right? Where is that the one we're referring to, where like kind of the organizational's, the organization's communication structure matches. You know what I'm saying? Like you're saying the tools will match exactly the way the organization operates, and that I think you're spot on. Like I'm coming from a world where now the development team is doing things like infrastructure as code and spinning up cloud environments and services and so on in the cloud microservices. So the tooling tends to reflect. Like you build it, you own it. That's much different than OT, where you have ops and these teams are much more segmented than in the kind of dynamic, ephemeral cloud native environments. So I think you're spot on that. Like the tools are going to rally around the way the organization is structured, and you got to think about the reason that is because the people who go out and advocate for procuring and obtaining these tools, they want to use them in the way that they operate in their organizational workflows, their daily activities. So they're going to go and say, hey, we need this tool, or we need that tool for this purpose. And procurement's going to go out and help them execute and obtain these tools, and it's because they have a specific pain point to the way they work in that unique organizational context. So I think you're absolutely spot on. I was just laughing because it's so true. The tools that the organization uses is going to look a lot like the way the organization operates.
Yeah, it doesn't do it much good to give the vulnerability management people the ability to remediate from the same tool if they're not allowed to do remediation.
Yep. Yeah.
So
They're going to
I
have to
can
go
see that.
talk to someone and say, hey, here's what we found. Here's, here's why it matters. And in the DevOps world where I do a lot of work, we're trying to feed that right to the developer because they wrote the code, they built the system, they, configured the infrastructure as code, et cetera. We want to empower them to fix the vulnerability during their workflow rather than, us kind of coming back with an out of band report that now they need to address.
Well, let's just finish up with the book itself. It's Effective Vulnerability Management, written by Chris Hughes and Nikki Robinson, available where all fine books are sold, as they say. The book came out. You were just at RSA last week. You're signing books. What's been the initial reaction to the book?
It's been amazing. And as you talked about earlier, I wrote, I have 2 books I wrote in the last, 10 months apart, roughly. The first one was on software supply chain security. And in that one, I luckily did have a co-author, his last name's Turner, who has an experience in ICS and OT, et cetera. And he brought a wealth of information, Tony Turner, that I didn't have. So sure. I'm sure you know Tony. But in the vulnerability management world, software supply chain security is still a bit of a niche subject, right? Vulnerability management, I found when a book came out, is one that everyone dreads or bemoans or has experienced painfully. And it's been the response has been amazing because everyone, whether they're an OT, IT, cloud native environment, Silicon Valley or enterprise Fortune 500, they know the pain of vulnerability management, and everyone's excited about the topic. And it's funny because it's something that we've been doing right since the onset of software, essentially, but it's kind of a new hot thing again. Is because we're realizing the way we do this is so fundamentally broken in so many ways, and people have so much pain associated with the process and the way we do things. So it's been amazing. I've had a blast chatting with people about it from all backgrounds, all industries, all levels of experience. It's really been cool.
And Chris, if someone wants to reach out to you, where are you active on? Which of the socials should they find you on?
Yeah, you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. I've dabbled into like Twitter/X once or twice. I just backed out. So there's a little different world than LinkedIn. Okay. So I stick to LinkedIn. I'm really active on there at Resilient Cyber. I have a Substack. I have a podcast, all with the same name, Resilient Cyber. I'm always happy to chat and learn from folks or, share resources if I can. So I'm pretty active, sharing at least, a couple times a day, things that I find useful or valuable. So feel free to reach out.
You're very active. I'm jealous of your productivity at times, the amount of articles and such you put out. So I would highly suggest you at least follow him on LinkedIn, because then you'll get all the notices of the articles. And my guess is once you start following him, you'll subscribe to the podcast and the Substack as well. So Chris, congratulations on the book, Effective Vulnerability Management. Thanks for coming on the show. And it was great to finally get a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, I've been following you, like I said, for a long time, and please keep up the great work. I subscribe to your content as well, so please keep it up.